Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. In this video, I'm going to read 4 poems out loud in order to illustrate how important it is to read poems out loud when you're trying to get to know them. This is the first step in my slow reading study process. And as you'll see, it also anticipates each of the other steps, from bean counting to ideas and questions. Reading a poem out loud really sets you up nicely to be able to study a poem closely. This page here is a category page from my website, which I don't really keep up to date these days. You can see the most recent post is almost a year ago. But from the most recent Reading Aloud post in early March 2023, all the way back to when I started the blog over 10 years ago, one thing I was committed to doing, at least for a while, was recording uh, recitations or recording the reading aloud of poetry. Now, these recordings are pretty bad. I didn't have great equipment. I still have pretty mediocre equipment. But even so, what this illustrates is that I've thought a long time about reading aloud, and I've loved reading poems out loud for a long time. If you go back and if people go back or have access to my student evals, one thing students consistently point out is that Dr. Hagen really likes reading texts aloud in class. And of course, I think this is pedagogically important because a text really changes when you feel it interface with your eyes, with your voice, with your breath, with your body. It comes alive in a way that it wasn't before. And at first, this can sound just sort of like romantic or sentimental mumbo jumbo, but it's really important for laying the groundwork for critical reading, close reading, the attentive, ethical reading, the close and slow study of poems that this channel is dedicated to. So let's read some poems out loud and see what we make of it. I'm going to look at the 4 poems that were featured in my previous video, and what I think I'm going to do is just read them out loud. And then if things occur to me while I'm doing that, I'll end the video by pointing out just a few things as a way to anticipate the later frameworks or the later steps in my process of getting to know them. So this is Morning Song by Sylvia Plath. Love set you going like a fat gold watch. The midwife slapped your foot soles, and your bald cry took its place among the elements. Our voices echo, magnifying your arrival. New statue. In a drafty museum, your nakedness shadows our safety. We stand round, blankly as walls. I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its own slow effacement at the wind's hand. All night your moth breath flickers among the flat pink roses. I wake to listen. A far sea moves in my ear. One cry, and I stumble from bed, cow-heavy and floral in my Victorian nightgown. Your mouth opens clean as a cat's. The window square whitens and swallows its dull stars. And now you try your handful of notes. The clear vowels rise like balloons. Whew. This is one of my favorite poems, and not just mine. It's a widely anthologized poem of Plath's, though perhaps less famous than poems like Lady Lazarus or Daddy. I'm also happy I messed up a little bit reading that out loud. It sort of breaks the ice, takes the pressure off having to read them perfectly. But before I get too carried away, I want to go on and read the next 3. This is the 3rd section of Alfred Lord Tennyson's long poem In Memoriam, A.H.H. I'm not entirely sure why Poetry Foundation includes the year here, but maybe for Tennyson scholars that they do consider that part of the title of the long poem. Anyway, as you can see, it's easy to get me off track. Third section, here we go. O sorrow, cruel fellowship, O priestess in the vaults of death, O sweet and bitter in a breath, what whispers from thy lying lip? The stars, she whispers, blindly run. A web is woven across the sky. From out waste places comes a cry and murmurs from the dying sun. And all the phantom nature stands with all the music in her tone, a hollow echo of my own, a hollow form with empty hands. And shall I take a thing so blind, embrace her as my natural good, or crush her like a vice of blood upon the threshold of the mind? In Memoriam is a really important poem for me. This isn't necessarily my favorite section, although it's one that was available on Poetry Foundation. Um, and although I don't typically like rhymed stanzas. I should say I don't prefer rhymed stanzas. Tennyson is such a master of this stanza form to such a degree that I think they are actually called in memoriam stanzas. But more about that in a future video, perhaps. This is Brood by Donika Kelly. My chest is earth. I meant to write my chest is warm, but earth will do to exhume a heart beat. I meant to write breathe. Did you know I was alive the whole time? I was alive in the ground, but torpor, slowed beat. My chest filled like a jar with dirt, I mean dearth. For slow months at rest in the hole I'd made in myself a frozen ground, a ground in thaw. I mean spring is coming. I mean I push the wet dirt with my mandible. I mean jaw, jaw. Y'all, I know I am not a nymph in exhumation, but would you please explain this half-remembered light? As we'll talk about again in a future video, this poem is perhaps for some people, it is for me, much more challenging to read out loud. Because when you read it out loud, you're faced with the challenge of missing punctuation. And that's challenging because without punctuation, it's sometimes difficult to understand how the phrases and lines work together. When a sentence comes to an end, when a sentence spills from line to line, but also, and I think this is what the missing punctuation affords, Kelly is able to pull off enjambment and end stop sort of simultaneously, where the end of a line can function both as the end of a sentence or phrase and continue and spill over into the next line. And in many ways, it might change from reading to reading. It's also worth noting that the published version of this poem, actually, this was published in 2017 in the journal Sewanee Review. In the 2025 collection, The Natural Order of Things, Kelly does adjust some of the phrasing, the positioning of the words. So I would highly encourage you, if you don't own that copy of that book, to go buy it and take a look at some of those differences. It's pretty fascinating. That'd be a whole other project to think about how the poem changes, both in the reading of it and then in the slow and close reading of it. The last poem I want to read is Sonnet 9. Again, this is not my favorite Shakespeare sonnet, and yet there are ways in which it illustrates some principles of reading aloud, but also it's very useful for modeling the process of slow reading that I'm gonna sort of be exploring much more in future videos. Sorry, my mind just kind of went blank for a bit. I think a little holdover from still reading Brood. So this is Sonnet 9. And this is on the Folger Library, Shakespeare Library website. This synopsis is not actually part of the poem. It's just there for people coming to the website to help orient you toward what the poem is about and what it's doing. And it clarifies for us that sonnets are arguments, at least Shakespeare's are. So here's Shakespeare. Is it for fear to wet a widow's eye that thou consumest thyself in single life? If thou issueless shalt hap to die, the world will wail thee like a makeless wife. The world will be thy widow, and still weep that thou no form of thee hast left behind. When every private widow well may keep by children's eyes her husband's mind, shape, and mind. Look what an unthrift in the world doth spend, shifts but his place, for still the world enjoys it. But beauty's waste hath in the world an end, and, kept unused, the user so destroys it. No love toward others in that bosom sits, that on himself such murderous shame commits. Okay, a little rusty on reading Shakespeare. I think many students struggle with Shakespeare sonnets, and they should. I know I do. I struggle if I'm just left alone with the sonnet to make sense of how it's moving. But reading it out loud and growing accustomed to, through the reading out loud, its punctuation. When Shakespeare ends his lines with punctuation, or when, as in the first line, we have an instance of enjambment that spills from line to line. Reading out loud prepares you to make those observations. And so when reading Shakespeare's sonnets in particular, reading aloud is so important for setting the stage and setting the scene for that next step of reading that I call bean counting. We know because it's a sonnet that it's 14 lines, but there's so many other parts to the bean counting phase that reading aloud prepares you to observe. More on that in the next video. But looping back to Morning Song, reading aloud also helps you observe things about the form and the figures that are in play. It also helps you notice and pay attention to the sound and the sense of the poem. So the first line in particular gets you into a sort of rhythm and nimble enough to move back and forth between stressed and unstressed syllables to set you up to learn to modify and modulate your rhythm as you read. Love set you going like a fat gold watch, right? You have the sort of triple stress at the end of the line, but also by reading it out loud, you get a sense of how Plath is manipulating your breath. Throughout the poem, there are many places to pause, and so you have these sort of snippets of sentences and lines that you always have plenty of breath to kind of get out until you get to the third tercet here. I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its own slow effacement at the wind's hand. I had to take a breath there. I was running out, but I didn't take a breath because there was an indication of a comma or a period. And in fact, there's a way in which it's so important that this stanza sort of takes your breath from you, and so that by the end you're breathless, because what's being said here, which is connected to the sort of sonic sound system element of the poem, what's being said here does take your breath away once you sit with it for a while. And when you sit with it for a while, you're also moving on to thinking about a figure of speech, a kind of negative metaphor, negative metaphor here, where the speaker is like a cloud, insofar as a cloud is also not the baby's mother. Um, anyway, there's a lot to chew on here and a lot to unpack, which we'll do in a future video. So we sense already how reading the poem out loud prepares you to think about the bean counting stage, how reading aloud prepares you to think about sound and sense, but also form and figures of speech. But then reading out loud also gets you thinking already about questions and ideas you might have. After all, the question about how to read Brood, how to make decisions as you read it out loud about when to pause, when to keep reading, is bound up with the ideas that the poem is also having. And questions will start to occur to you, like, for instance, how as one is reading, one is supposed to distinguish between these these italicized lines and words, which always follow a statement of what the speaker meant to say or meant to write, raises questions about what it means for a poem to both exist and to work into itself original intentions that aren't expressed by the non-italicized lines. So we get a sense that the poem already, by struggling as a reader to think about how I would signal that difference there, you come to the idea, you come to the sense that the poem is kind of about expression, about meaning, about writing, about speaking. And that speaking is particularly important to the kind of imagery that the poem incorporates into itself. Reading aloud Tennyson as well, I think when you become sensitive to the movement of the Tennyson stanza, you also take on a sense of what each of the sections of In Memoriam is actually doing, which is playing out a certain thought experiment and a certain puzzle that people face when they're in mourning. Here, Tennyson personifies his sadness and sorrow as a liar. And we can see that reading the poem out loud helps you organize and situate yourself in a kind of antagonism to that feeling. But then he gives the feeling, because the feeling is personified, two stanzas to whisper its lies to us. And those lies are so persuasive. If you've managed to feel your way in, or if because of some loss of yourself you're already in mourning, those lies feel so true. And then he backs out. If we're paying attention as we read to when he's using quotation marks or not, we realize that the question at the very end, like the question that begins the poem, is in the speaker's voice again. And he's starting to wonder what his relationship to this sorrow should be. Anyway, uh, I think I'll stop there before I carry on too much longer, but I hope you see how just reading 4 different poems out loud already moves you, moves me anyway, into the kind of work that the other steps of slow, careful, closer reading is going to dive deeper into. Anyway, thanks for reading poems with me today. I'll see you next time.